Big Shaq walks into a luxury restaurant and gets turned away. No seat, no excuse. But before walking out, Big Shaq says one line, and it hits harder than any headline. The moment goes viral, the internet explodes, and suddenly the whole world's talking about what really happened behind those polished doors. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. Shaquille O'Neal had walked into thousands of rooms in his life, arenas roaring with fans, school gymnasiums filled with wide-eyed kids, charity galas where his name alone turned heads. But that morning as he stepped into Bellevue's, a luxury restaurant tucked between glass towers and designer boutiques in downtown Atlanta, there was no roar, no recognition, no warmth. He wore a navy blue track jacket, worn jeans, and spotless white sneakers. No entourage, no flashing cameras, just the unmistakable silhouette of a man whose presence filled the doorway before he even crossed the threshold. His size alone commanded attention, but the hostess behind the polished marble stand barely looked up. Her eyes flicked to him for a moment, then quickly returned to the iPad in front of her, politeness wrapped in cold efficiency. Shaq smiled softly, the kind of smile that said he was used to all this, being underestimated, misjudged. He approached with a light nod. "Good morning." The hostess didn't return the greeting. She glanced around the dining room, then back at the screen, tapping as if searching for an answer that didn't require actual hospitality. "Do you have a reservation?" "No, ma'am," he said, voice calm. "I was hoping to get a table for one." She pursed her lips. "We're fully booked at the moment." Shaq's gaze lifted past her, scanning the half-full dining area. White tablecloths, sunlight pouring through floor-to-ceiling windows, couples sipping champagne. Several tables near the back sat completely unoccupied, already set with silverware and glistening glasses. He didn't point them out. He'd seen this movie before. Same script, different set.
"That's all right," he said, stepping back. "I can wait."
Her mouth tightened. "It could be a long wait. We really are very full today." Shaq looked her in the eyes. Not angry, not even surprised, just tired. "I've waited longer for less," he murmured under his breath, stepping aside to a bench along the wall. He sat down, legs stretched awkwardly in the narrow space, arms folded across his chest. The room didn't freeze when he entered, but it stiffened. Conversations didn't stop. They just shifted. People kept eating, but their eyes darted toward him between bites. A man in a suit across the aisle whispered something to his wife, who glanced up startled, then quickly looked away. A table of young professionals paused, recognizing him too late to be casual about it. The silence around Shaq thickened, a bubble of muted discomfort. He checked his phone but didn't scroll. He wasn't here for Instagram moments. He was hungry. Simple as that. But more than that, he wanted normalcy. A quiet brunch like any other man. That seemed to be too much. Behind the scenes, the manager had been watching. His name was Derek, sharp-dressed, slick smile, the kind of man who measured people at a glance and calculated their worth by appearance. He leaned in close to the hostess, whispering without glancing. Shaq's way. Whatever was said, it cemented the decision. No table, no service. Shaq noticed. Of course he did. Not just the whispers, but the absence of eye contact. The way Derek casually moved back to greet a white couple at the door with exaggerated cheer. The way laughter returned to the hostess's voice when she greeted them with a champagne offer. That invisible line drawn across the floor, just beneath the polished tile dividing who belonged from who didn't. But Shaq didn't stand up. He waited. Minutes ticked by. Servers moved around him, none acknowledging his presence. One or two recognized him. He saw it in their eyes, that flicker of awe, but they said nothing. Their silence wasn't theirs alone. It was institutional. It was learned. Outside, the Atlanta sun gleamed off the chrome buildings. Tourists passed by, some peering inside, not recognizing the quiet story unfolding in plain sight. Inside, the restaurant hummed with artificial peace. Then came the moment that would change everything. A young woman seated at a table near the window had been watching from the beginning. Not because she recognized him at first, she didn't, but because of the energy in the room. Her name was Lana West, a local writer and amateur documentarian. She was working on a piece about refined segregation, how modern establishments use performance politeness to exclude without ever using a slur. This, she realized, was a living example. She didn't start filming right away, not until she overheard the manager say something behind the counter, something that made her skin crawl, We want the right kind of clientele. That's when her phone came out. Quiet, discreet, aimed just right. She still didn't know who he was, but something about his stillness, his grace in the face of dismissal, drew her in. He wasn't causing a scene. He wasn't demanding justice. He was just there, like a mountain waiting to be acknowledged. And that made the silence louder. 15 minutes in, the hostess approached him again. Her smile was tighter now, like a wound. "Sir," she said, clipped. "Unfortunately, we're unable to seat you today. I'm going to have to ask that you wait outside if you're not dining with us." Shaq stood slowly, towering, calm. He looked around the room one last time, not to intimidate, to witness, to let them see him, seeing them. And then he said nothing. Not a word. He turned, walked to the glass doors, and stepped back into the sunlight. Outside, he paused, looked up at the sky like it might hold a better answer. Then, almost to himself, he said, "I wonder how many seats I've earned, and still can't sit down."
Lana caught it.
Every word. Clear as day. She didn't know who he was until she uploaded the clip that afternoon, and the internet erupted. But that moment, that line, would ripple through a nation. Inside Bellevue's, brunch went on like nothing happened. But out there, something had shifted. And Shaq, the big Aristotle, the diesel, walked on without looking back. The moment Shaq settled into the stiff wooden bench near the entryway, the temperature in the room changed, not literally, but emotionally. It was a soft, almost imperceptible drop, like the hush that precedes a sermon or a storm. He sat without fidgeting, his massive hands resting calmly on his knees, eyes occasionally drifting to the sunlight cascading through the restaurant's high windows. To an outsider, he looked like a man enjoying the quiet, but those attuned to the subtleties would see it differently. A man being silently tried and measured by a jury he never asked for. The hostess, now occupied with other guests, never looked in his direction again. Her shoulders relaxed noticeably once she had moved on. She offered menus and mimosa suggestions with a brightness that hadn't made an appearance when she'd spoken to Shaq. Across the room, servers navigated between tables, never accidentally brushing too close to where he sat. There was no water offered, no brief "someone will be right with you." He existed outside the dining experience, like a portrait on the wall, visible but not present. The guests, predominantly white, mostly wealthy, performed their discomfort in hushed tones. A man in his 60s, face angular and trimmed in expensive confidence, leaned closer to his wife and whispered behind his menu. His wife, wrapped in pearls and posture, gave a tight smile before lowering her eyes. At a corner booth, two women in tennis skirts paused mid-conversation, one of them catching sight of Shaq and muttering something that made the other glance sharply, then nod with something between agreement and unease. There was no one yelling, no insults hurled, no direct confrontation. But that was the cruelty of it. This wasn't hatred thrown in your face. It was resistance wrapped in civility. It was avoidance masked as manners. This was a racism, fluent in fine dining, knowing how to weaponize indifference with surgical precision. And Shaq, who had faced louder prejudice in his youth, recognized this form instantly. This was the polite kind, the kind that smiled at you while it closed the door. Still, he sat. Still, he smiled. He didn't look around searching for kindness. He didn't expect it here. But he noticed the shifts, the tightening of shoulders, the glances that flicked to him and darted away, the way the server refilled every table's water, except the one closest to him. That table just 5 feet from where he sat was occupied by a young couple. The woman kept her back straight, legs crossed, eyes flicking between her partner and Shaq, as though trying not to seem curious. The man, clearly uncomfortable, stood up once to speak to the hostess, gesturing with a barely noticeable thumb over his shoulder in Shaq's direction. When he returned to his table, the woman whispered something, and he nodded quickly, avoiding eye contact with Shaq. Shaq caught the movement, not the words, but he knew the type, whispered paranoia that dressed itself as caution. Still, no one said anything to him. Minutes crawled. The brunch service picked up pace, clinks of silverware, the dull murmur of conversation, the occasional ring of laughter, all seemed to swirl around Shaq without touching him. He wasn't part of the brunch crowd, and everyone seemed silently committed to keeping it that way. What they didn't know was how much quieter moments like this said about a place, about a people, than any news headline could. Shaq had been wealthy for decades, famous since his 20s, But none of it armored him here. No net worth could shield him from the sting of being tolerated, instead of welcomed. Even as the world watched him in commercials, bought sneakers bearing his name, shared clips of him dancing with kids at basketball clinics, this room only saw what it wanted to. The sound of a phone camera shutter broke the rhythm. It came from behind a tall plant near the window. Lana West was still watching, filming discreetly. She wasn't being performative about it. No exaggerated gasps, no loud narration. Just a steady, slow capture of what was not happening. Her instinct told her that this scene was more than a celebrity being ignored. It was the anatomy of exclusion unfolding, and the subtlety made it sharper. Shaq shifted slightly, adjusting how he sat. It was a small movement, but it seemed to echo across the room. Two men at the bar glanced his way. One of them chuckled low, nudging the other with a smirk that suggested a joke at Shaq's expense. The kind of joke that wasn't said aloud but was understood anyway. Shaq didn't react. He didn't need to. He'd learned long ago that silence could be heavier than any comeback. The sound system played soft jazz, Miles Davis, ironically, the kind of music born from black struggle and brilliance now used to decorate a space that casually rejected the man whose life embodied both. It was almost poetic in its irony. As Shaq watched the servers tend to other tables, his mind drifted, not away from the moment, but deeper into it. He remembered his mother's voice. Lucille had always been his compass. As a boy, when he came home confused after being turned away from a toy store with his cousins, she had knelt in front of him and said, "You don't have to fight every time you're challenged. Just don't let them shrink you. That's their goal, to make you forget how big you are. And not just physically, spiritually, culturally, emotionally." Here, in this polished room of wealth and whispered judgments, that lesson mattered more than ever. He glanced out the window, watching as a cyclist rolled past, oblivious to the quiet war being fought inside. Not with fists, not even with words, just stares, shrugs, smiles that didn't reach the eyes. That's where racism had evolved into invisibility, into etiquette. A man at the adjacent table stood abruptly. He had the look of a financier, clean lines, expensive haircut, too much cologne. He made a show of adjusting his jacket, then leaned into the hostess stand and muttered something. She gave a rehearsed nod and handed him a takeout bag, though he hadn't ordered anything to go. As he passed Shaq, their eyes met for half a second. The man offered a nod that tried to say no offense but carried the weight of everything left unsaid. Shaq's jaw tightened for just a moment. That was enough. He stood. Slowly, deliberately. The bench creaked as he rose, and every nearby conversation dimmed by a few decibels. Not silent, but adjusted. Shaq looked around one last time. Not searching for vindication, but acknowledgement. There was none. Just more flickering gazes, and the heavy perfume of denial. Then, in that sterile hush, he turned and walked toward the door. Not storming out. Not defeated. Just moving on. Like a man carrying the weight of stairs that had never known how to see him. And outside, just beyond the glass, the sky was wide open. The moment he stepped through those doors, Lana stopped filming, but she didn't stop feeling. Something in her had shifted too. The story wasn't finished. It was just beginning. The hostess returned with a precision smile that looked practiced in the mirror, the kind designed not to invite conversation, but to end it politely. She stopped just short of Shaq, held her tablet in both hands like a shield, and said the words with measured rhythm. "I'm sorry, sir, fully booked." Shaq didn't move. He had heard those words already. Once from her, and a dozen times in the space between silence and stares. But hearing it again, with that exact practiced tone, like an employee reading from a manual that instructs them how to deny with dignity, brought a different kind of stillness to his chest. He looked past her, not rudely, just observantly. 3 tables to the left sat unclaimed, their white cloths still untouched, cutlery precisely placed, water glasses half filled in anticipation. Another booth by the window had just been wiped clean, menus already back in place. He noticed all of it, not with disbelief, but with clarity. This wasn't miscommunication, it was a decision, one already made. He looked back at the hostess. Her smile was thinner now, stretched to its polite breaking point. She knew he knew. And he knew she wouldn't say more. Shaq nodded once, slowly. "I understand." 3 words. Calm, low, unbothered on the surface. But deep in his chest, something knotted. Not anger. Anger was easy. This was heavier. like memory pressing against his ribs. The restaurant returned to its rhythm, though quieter. The message had been received. The man by the door was not to be served. With the matter closed, the hostess turned on her heels and returned to the podium without another glance. Shaq stood for a moment longer, absorbing the space, not its beauty, but its refusal. As he stepped back toward the exit, sunlight caught the corner of his eye through the grand glass facade. It pulled him forward. The door clicked shut behind him, and the air outside felt cooler than it should have been. Brighter too, as if the moment inside had dulled the light, and only now did it resume full force. He walked slowly along the sidewalk, not toward his car, not toward anything in particular. His footsteps were measured, his posture tall. But inside, scenes began to surface, as if his body had decided to process what his face had refused to show. He was 9 again, walking into a toy store with his mom and younger cousin. He remembered the excitement rows of action figures, the kind of stuff he dreamed about from the window of the city bus. His cousin had raced ahead toward the basketball sets, his little hands already lifting a miniature rim off the shelf. Shaq had followed, already picking out the one he'd been saving up for, but they hadn't been in the aisle 10 minutes before a clerk approached them, stiff smile in place. "Can I help you, boys?" The tone hadn't matched the words. Lucille had appeared almost instantly, a calm shadow behind them. "They're fine. We're shopping." The man had said nothing more. But he hadn't left either. He'd followed them through 2 more aisles, pretending to tidy, but watching, always watching. Back then, Shaq hadn't fully understood. But he remembered how Lucille's jaw had been tight as they left, how she hadn't said anything until they got back in the car. Then she turned in her seat, looked at them both, and said, "Some folks don't know how to treat you right. That don't mean you act wrong. You hear me?" Shaq heard her now. That voice was like scripture, tattooed across the years, echoing louder than the slight from the hostess. Lucille's lessons had never been about retaliation. They were about gravity. How to carry yourself when the world made you feel like you didn't belong in rooms you helped build. As he rounded the corner and found a shaded bench outside a small bookstore, he sat down. People passed by, some recognizing him, some not. He smiled at a toddler pointing at him with chocolate on his face. The boy's mother grabbed the child quickly, muttering an apology. Eyes wide, Shaq raised a hand to wave, gently, and the child smiled back, waving through sticky fingers. Shaq leaned back on the bench, closed his eyes for a second, and let the moment breathe. The rejection at Bellevue's didn't surprise him. It didn't even wound him the way it once might have. But it reminded him how far image could go, and still fall short of acceptance. He could be a legend, a millionaire, a man who built basketball courts in neighborhoods others forgot. But in a space like that restaurant, dressed in casual comfort, asking for nothing more than a seat, none of that mattered. That wasn't about fame. That was about something deeper, older. As he sat in that quiet space, a thought passed through him, light but piercing. How many rooms have I entered that were never meant for me, even after I became me? It wasn't pity he felt. It was perspective. The kind that settled into your bones, reshaped how you saw the world, and your place in it. He didn't need to confront the hostess. He didn't need to post online or call out the injustice with hashtags. The lesson here wasn't for them. It was for the watchers. The ones who would see what happened next. The ones who'd understand what was truly denied that day. Wasn't just a table, but the recognition of worth earned, of dignity deserved. Somewhere behind the tinted windows of Bellevue's, the brunch crowd buzzed on, but outside, the real story had already begun. And it wasn't over. Lana West wasn't supposed to be filming that day. She'd gone to Bellevue's not for work but for curiosity, a recommendation from a colleague, a sleek downtown brunch spot with a reputation for elevated experiences, and a wait list that made people feel important. She'd brought her notebook out of habit, but the camera had been tucked into her bag, an afterthought, until the moment Shaquille O'Neal walked in. At first she didn't recognize him, not immediately. The man was huge, impossible to miss. But dressed so casually, with none of the celebrity aura that usually wrapped around public figures like a second skin. There were no bodyguards, no loud arrivals, just a tall, broad-shouldered man, walking in with a simple request and a quiet demeanor. But it wasn't his size or his presence that caught Lana's attention. It was the air shift. She noticed how the hostess froze for a beat longer than necessary. How her voice dipped an octave into something artificial. How the manager hovered nearby, eyes sharp, Posture coiled. It was the stillness around the bench where the man, Shaq, though she didn't know yet, sat. The way people's conversations slid into whispers. Eyes flicked over menus but didn't really read them. The collective unease that rose like humidity. That's when Lana knew something was unfolding. Not loud, not headline-grabbing, but important. She slipped her phone from her bag with practiced discretion, propping it just so against her water glass. It faced the entrance, the hostess stand, and the corner where Shaq had taken his place. She activated the wide-angle lens. Then she waited. She'd seen scenes like this before, both in life and in her content. Her vlog, Silent Lines, explored invisible social boundaries. Who gets served, who gets seen, who gets brushed off while everyone pretends it's about protocol. She'd filmed bouncers skipping over black teens in line at clubs, waiters conveniently forgetting to check on brown-skinned patrons while tables next to them got dessert menus twice. But this moment felt heavier, because slowly, piece by piece, she began to realize who the man was. First it was the side profile. Familiar, like a statue half remembered. Then it was his voice, deep but smooth, the tone of someone used to being both heard and ignored. Then it hit her, like a spark. Shaquille O'Neal. Not just the basketball player, not just the celebrity, but the guy whose name came up in stories of kindness, unexpected generosity, random moments of humility. She remembered a clip where he paid off a family's layaway bill, another where he helped a stranded driver push their car. Her own cousin had met him once, at a charity school event, and said, "He hugged me like I was family." And here he was, alone, waiting, being silently denied. Lana's hands tightened around her phone. Her heart ticked faster, not from excitement, but urgency. This moment wasn't about catching a celebrity off guard. It was about exposing the machinery around him, the layers of practiced exclusion that operated with surgical grace. The real subject wasn't Shaq, it was the ecosystem around him. She captured the glances, the body language, the sideways comments that didn't sound offensive unless you'd heard them 100 times before. She caught the couple who debated moving tables, the man at the bar who smirked after glancing at Shaq's sneakers, the waitress who made a wide arc to avoid walking near him. It was all there, subtle, but damning. Then came the hostess. Lana zoomed slightly, careful to keep the shot stable. The woman's smile was back, like someone applying makeup after being caught frowning. She said the line with too much ease. "I'm sorry, sir. We're fully booked." Lana's eyes darted to the tables, 4 still unoccupied, 1 just cleaned. Shaq didn't argue. He simply nodded, said he understood. But the look in his eyes, quiet, weighted, tired, punched Lana harder than any confrontation could have. That was when she stopped being an observer and felt something deeper. Responsibility. This wasn't just content. This was testimony. She kept filming as he left, kept the camera rolling as he paused outside, lifting his gaze skyward like he was searching for something beyond human reason. And then he said it, soft almost to himself, but clear enough for the mic to pick up. "I wonder how many seats I've earned, and still can't sit down." Lana lowered her phone slowly, like someone putting down a holy object. Her breath hitched. The sentence wasn't loud. It didn't try to be profound. But it was. Because in that moment, she heard the echo of every unspoken story behind it. Every young black kid turned away from opportunity. Every working-class mother dismissed in luxury spaces. Every success story still treated like an intruder. That line wasn't just about brunch. It was about the structure beneath it. She didn't upload the video immediately. She watched it twice more at home, alone in her studio apartment. She edited nothing. No captions, no dramatic music, just raw footage. Shaq's moment of dignity filmed with reverence. She uploaded it with a single-sentence description. "This happened today in Atlanta. Listen closely." Then she logged off. By morning, the clip had over 3 million views. And climbing. Celebrities reposted it. Sports figures commented beneath it. Civil rights advocates wrote essays about it. People who hadn't been inside Bellevue's or even Atlanta responded with stories of their own. Rejections in lobbies, in offices, at high-end boutiques. The hashtag and seats began trending by noon. But none of it changed what Lana felt when she looked at that footage again. A man sitting in quiet judgment of a world that still hadn't learned to see him. Not just as a legend, but as a person who belonged. The world knew Shaq. But now they'd seen him. Not laughing. Not performing. Just existing. And in that existence, the whole system cracked. Lena didn't know what would come next. Whether Shaq would speak out, whether the restaurant would respond. But she knew one thing for sure. She hadn't captured a viral moment. She'd captured a fault line breaking open. And nothing would be the same again. The door to Bellevue's closed behind him, with the soft click of indifference. Shaquille O'Neal stood on the sidewalk, bathed in mid-morning sunlight. As life moved around him like water around stone, cars glided past. A cyclist zipped down the opposite lane, headphones in, unaware across the street. A group of tourists posed in front of a mural, smiling like nothing in the world could ever be wrong. And in that moment, Shaq simply stood there, silent, still, not as a man abandoned, but as a monument to restraint. He didn't check his phone, didn't glance back at the restaurant that had refused him a seat, despite its empty tables. His arms hung loosely by his sides, fingers twitching slightly, as if resisting the urge to clench. But there was no storm on his face, just something deeper, something quieter. Grace. He took 2 steps forward, away from the door, and paused beside a city tree, whose branches barely offered shade. He looked up, not in despair, but with the weight of years resting quietly behind his gaze. The sun framed his silhouette, highlighting every crease in his brow, every thought unspoken. That's when the flashbacks began, not to games or victories or endorsements, but to moments that shaped the steel beneath his calm. He was 12, standing in the middle of a schoolyard, surrounded by taunts. A boy half his size had thrown the first insult. Another joined in, trying to provoke him. Shaq had been taller, broader, easily strong enough to knock either of them down. But he hadn't moved. Lucille's voice had echoed in his head. Your strength ain't your fists, it's your choice not to use them. He remembered walking home that day with his backpack hanging low, eyes burning. He'd asked his mom why she didn't fight the school, why she didn't march in and demand justice. She'd looked at him, calm and firm. Because you're gonna face worse than this, and I need you to learn how to hold your crown without breaking it. Not every fight is a win, even when you swing. Some fights, baby, you win by standing still. Now, on that Atlanta sidewalk, those words returned like scripture. Shaq took a slow breath, the kind you take before speaking something sacred. His chest rose and fell. He didn't cry. He didn't curse. He just looked up into the brightness of the morning, like it might have the answers. The world refused to give. And then he spoke barely above a whisper, but with a clarity that sliced through the noise of the city. I wonder how many seats I've earned, and still can't sit down. The line wasn't meant for anyone. It wasn't performative. It was a thought set free, but Lana West, still across the street, caught it with precision. Her camera, still rolling from inside her tote, zoomed in as Shaq turned away from the restaurant, not defeated, not shamed, but taller than before, as if by being denied, he'd remembered who he really was. She knew the moment would haunt her. Not in sorrow, but in reverence. It wasn't just the words, it was everything beneath them. The restraint, the pain wrapped in dignity, the history behind the calm. Shaq began walking again, his strides long but unhurried. He wasn't going anywhere specific, just forward, past a newsstand, past a busker playing blues guitar, past a group of young men who recognized him, their expressions shifting from disbelief to awe. None of them called out, they simply stepped aside, letting him pass like he was royalty. Silent, powerful, unquestioned. He turned the corner and found a low bench beneath a rusted lamppost. He sat, the wood groaned under his weight. He stretched one leg out, rubbed a hand across his jaw and stared at nothing. Just breathe. Inside, his mind wandered again, to another memory. This time, he was 18. Just signed to LSU. National attention. Reporters. Pressure. His mother had pulled him aside in their kitchen one night, just the two of them, and said, "The world don't care how many points you score if they still see you as a threat. So you stay calm, you stay kind, but never small." He'd nodded then. He nodded again now. Across the digital universe, things were already shifting. The footage Lana had uploaded only hours ago was catching fire. At first a few retweets, then shares, then trending. But Shaq didn't know that yet. He just sat alone in the open, invisible only to those who chose not to look. To everyone else, especially those who'd ever been quietly pushed to the side, politely denied, or softly uninvited. He was becoming something else entirely. Not just a man, not just a symbol, but a reminder of how restraint could roar. of how dignity could confront injustice without needing to raise a hand or a voice, of how grace, when wielded by someone who had every right to be angry, became a revolution in silence. Shaq leaned forward, elbows on knees, and watched the world pass. He didn't know what would come next. He didn't know what headlines might follow, or how the world would spin his quiet protest into conversation. All he knew was that today, in a city that had cheered his name in arenas and sold his face on billboards, a door had been closed, not with words but with intention, and he had chosen not to kick it down, but to walk away with everything they'd tried to deny him intact: his peace, his purpose, and his power. That moment, though small to some, would become the spark, because when someone like Shaq chose grace over outrage, the world had no choice but to listen. The sky had no answers, but Shaq looked up anyway. The world continued around him in its noisy rhythms: traffic hums, crosswalk beeps, heels on concrete, conversations about coffee and contracts. And yet for a single moment on that Atlanta sidewalk, everything felt impossibly still, like time itself paused to hear what would come next. Shaq took one last glance at Bellevue's polished facade, the glass still reflecting a distorted version of him. Then, with a sigh both silent and seismic, he spoke, not loudly, not theatrically, but with the full weight of a lifetime behind the words. "I wonder how many seats I've earned, and still can't sit down." The sentence, delivered to no one and everyone, came out like breath released after holding it too long. It wasn't laced with bitterness, nor did it carry any plea. It was raw thought, cracked open in real time. A reflection dressed as poetry, the kind of truth that doesn't echo, it settles. Lana, still across the street and tucked just behind a lamppost, caught it all. Her mic, primed more out of instinct than intent, recorded the line with crisp precision. She heard it live, but it hit differently when she played it back on her laptop that evening. The way he said it, like someone who'd never meant to speak it aloud, but couldn't hold it in any longer. She played it again and again. The meaning was undeniable. It wasn't about brunch. It wasn't about that particular restaurant or those particular people. It was about the quiet, recurring pain of being told, without being told, that you don't belong, no matter how many doors you've unlocked, no matter how many accolades follow your name. It was about being Shaquille O'Neal, 7'1", MVP philanthropist, cultural icon, and still being weighed against outdated assumptions before anyone even asked for your name. Lana sat in her dim apartment, backlit by the glow of her screen. The raw footage sat in her editing software. The entire clip was barely over 2 minutes. She didn't add filters, didn't crop it, didn't layer music or subtitles. It didn't need any of that. The moment was too pure, too surgical. She'd captured the glance at the empty tables, the cold precision of the hostess's dismissal, the way the staff moved with measured caution around a man who had bent the world to his name. And then, finally, that line, that closing thought, that sounded like it had been simmering for years. There was no question of what to do next. Lana wrote a brief caption. "Today I saw grace under rejection. Listen."
Then she hit upload.
Within minutes the comments trickled in, then surged. People recognized Shaq instantly. Others didn't, but it didn't matter. The humanity of the moment, his pause, his words, his composure cut through demographics. Black viewers, in particular, flooded the replies with their own stories. Some had lived it at job interviews, others in corporate boardrooms, at luxury dealerships, on college campuses, in elevators where their presence alone made others clutch handbags. It wasn't the denial that made the video go viral. It was the restraint. The truth behind the line was so layered, it demanded reflection. How many times do black men and women build, serve, excel, only to be told that a seat isn't available, that the space is full, that their presence is disruptive to the aesthetic, the mood, the comfort of others? And all of that was wrapped in a single quiet sentence from a man who could have called a press conference, could have demanded headlines, could have flipped the narrative with a single phone call. But didn't. He chose grace. Shaq, meanwhile, didn't know the storm was brewing online. He was still sitting on that public bench 2 blocks away, now sipping a bottle of water someone had handed him in passing. No entourage, no reporters, just him and the city, quietly coexisting again. The restaurant was already in his rear view, not even a footnote in his memory, but the words had escaped him, and now they had wings. By the time he finally checked his phone, unearned seats had already entered the national conversation, and he hadn't posted a thing. That's how revolutions begin sometimes. Not with fists, but with silence that dares to speak. Not with confrontation, but with calm so powerful, it makes the world question its comfort. Shaq had walked away, but the line he left behind stayed. And now, it was traveling. By evening, Lana West's video had ignited a fire. Screens around the world glowed with the same image. Shaquille O'Neal, standing silently outside Bellevue's. The words he spoke hanging in the air like a challenge. Social media feeds filled with his phrase, "I wonder how many seats I've earned, and still can't sit down," repeated in posts, tweets, stories. The hashtag "Nerned Seats" climbed, first to national prominence, then global resonance. Celebrities with massive followings joined the chorus. A well-known actor reposted the clip with, "When grace speaks louder than 1,000 tweets." A talk show host shared the video during a broadcast, pausing mid-segment to ask, "How often have we denied someone their place, even when they've earned it?" Athletes, musicians, influencers, all echoed the sentiment. It wasn't just Shaq's fame that fueled the wave. It was the truth in his restraint, and the universality of that experience. Activists called it a moment of clarity. Social justice organizations tweeted their condolences, and Commitments, a nonprofit dedicated to combating systemic bias, wrote, "Your silence is louder than their denial." Earned seats. They turned Shaq's moment into a nationwide campaign, translating it into an initiative, encouraging businesses to audit their policies, remove invisible barriers, and rehearse hospitality beyond scripted politeness. Ordinary citizens shared their stories, flooding comments and posts with testimonies of exclusion and quiet dismissal. A corporate executive confessed she had been overlooked for a promotion despite outperforming her peers. A college graduate revealed he was accompanied to every interview because hiring managers kept returning his calls to ensure I was the real deal. Over and over, the same tune, achievement and excellence, but still being shown the door. News anchors dissected it all. Morning panels debated. Evening hosts scrutinized. Conservative commentators circled the story like vultures, suggesting Shaq was staging an act for attention. Progressives countered with statistical evidence on implicit bias and institutional racism. Talk show guests argued over the line itself. Isn't speaking out enough, or is the silence that holds space without anger stronger? Even the restaurant was dragged into the spotlight. Bellevue's released a statement that evening. Polite, corporate, engineered to calm the storm, not resolve it. "We deeply regret the perception caused by the incident on our patio. We strive for excellence and inclusive service. We are reviewing protocols to ensure all guests feel welcome." That last part, "feel welcome," ignited more criticism. How do you feel welcome when no one even offered you a seat? Under the owner's name, a personal apology followed. "If Mr. O'Neal was made to feel unwelcome, we sincerely apologize." The phrase, "made to feel," threw fuel on the fire. Because Shaq didn't just feel unwelcome, he was unwelcome. The crisis management language triggered a new wave of backlash. Unearned seats shifted gears from reflection to demand. People were calling for transparency. A few found loopholes in the restaurant's reservation app. They posted screenshots from the brunch hours, showing plenty of available tables. Others called out the PR statement as performative. All of this while Shaq stayed silent. He hadn't posted a word. No official comment. No interviews. No press release. Nothing. It was as if he had stepped off the stage and returned to the real world, letting the echo of his moment speak for him. And the world was listening. Some expected outrage. Some expected a viral rebuttal. Instead, a photo surfaced of him in a quiet church in Atlanta. The next day, no team, no cameras, eyes closed, hands folded in prayer. Another image from a local bookstore showed him browsing quietly, brows furrowed, absorbed in titles about social justice, history, and human rights. He was somewhere else, and that was deliberate. Media circled. Journalists knocked on his publicist's door, but his silence only made the story deeper. When someone like Shaq chooses not to monetize or amplify his narrative through media channels, people listen differently. They sense sincerity. They sense depth. They sense integrity in not playing the game of attention. Meanwhile, the Earned Seats hashtag gave birth to its own virtual community. Threads appeared with advice for Black professionals navigating subtle rejection. One thread offered tips on approaching corporate leaders and reframing conversations from "why wasn't I chose" to "here's what I've earned." Another thread gave users a template to gift Bellevue's gift cards, not as patronage but as a challenge for the restaurant to invite those they've overlooked. In social hubs, Videos of black families dining confidently in upscale restaurants flooded feeds, each tagged with the hashtag, "We've earned these seats. We belong here." The movement wasn't about boycotting. It was about being seen. Still, the restaurant's analytics glowed red. Foot traffic dipped, reservations stalled. Some food bloggers who once praised its ambiance turned critical. Bellevue's may feature crystal and couture, but it forgot character. One influencer called it a palace built on polished prejudice. Through it all, Shaq stayed out of the fray, and that silence amplified every reaction. It made people realize the moment was his gift to the world, not a PR stunt. It forced others to fill the space he left vacated with their stories and their truths. As the week's end approached, pundits predicted two outcomes. Either Shaq would break the silence and the world would shift focus, or he would stay silent and wait for something deeper to follow. He stayed silent. He didn't need to speak. His silence had already spoken louder than any statement could. He had cast a question: how many seats have you earned? And still can't sit down. And the world was still waiting on answers. The sound of gravel crunched beneath Shaq's tires as he pulled into the driveway of his mother's modest brick home on the west side of town. It was early morning, just after the city began to stir. The chaos of headlines and viral outrage felt distant here. There were no cameras, no fans, no expectations, just peace, and the one woman who never treated him like a spectacle. Lucille O'Neal was already waiting at the front door, arms crossed, wearing her familiar navy robe and slippers that had molded to her stride over the years. Her eyes held warmth, but also concern, like she'd been watching the storm from afar and knew exactly why her son had come home. Shaq stepped out of the SUV, his frame nearly grazing the roof, as he emerged. He didn't say anything right away, just walked up the porch steps and let her hug him like he was still the boy who used to come home with scraped knees and stories of being left out. She didn't ask about the restaurant. She didn't mention the video. Instead, she said, "I made breakfast," and led him inside like it was any other Sunday. The kitchen smelled like coffee and cornbread. The walls were still lined with old photos, baby pictures, high school jerseys, faded newspaper clippings about his first college game. He sat at the table where he'd once wrestled with math homework, now resting his arms on the same grooves his elbows had made years ago. Lucille poured coffee into a chipped mug and set it in front of him without a word. Then she sat across from him, hands folded. "You tired?" she asked. Shaq nodded. "Yeah, but not in my body." She reached across the table, touched his hand. "It's a different kind of tired." "I know." He looked at her, eyes heavy with a weight even fame couldn't lighten. "I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. But they all heard it." Lucille didn't smile, but she nodded slowly, knowingly. "That's because it wasn't just your voice. That was your soul speaking." Shaq lowered his gaze, the lines around his eyes deepening. "I just didn't expect it to hit like that. I wasn't trying to start anything." "You didn't start it," she said. "You just refused to carry it in silence this time." She stood, walked to the living room bookshelf, and returned holding a yellowing envelope. It was worn, edges curling, sealed but soft from years of handling. She placed it in front of him. "I found this a few months ago, in one of your stepfather's old Bibles," she said. "He wrote it before he passed, never gave it to you. Said it wasn't time yet." Shaq took the envelope gently. The handwriting was familiar. Firm, neat, a little slanted. He hadn't seen that script in years, but it still tugged something deep. Lucille stood again, giving him space. "I'll be in the garden. Take your time." He opened the letter slowly, unfolding the paper like it might crack from age. The ink was faded, but clear. "Son," it began. "If you're reading this, it means the world has shown you its teeth again. I'm sorry for that. I hoped it wouldn't have to, but I knew better. You were born into a world that sees size before soul, strength before substance. They'll always test your silence, bait your patience, and pretend to question your worth. Not because they don't know it, but because they do. Dignity, son, isn't just how you walk through applause. It's how you walk away from insult without bending. It's not weakness, it's legacy. I watched you grow into a giant. But more than that, I watched you grow into a man who knew when not to swing. That's power. Don't ever forget it. You'll be tempted to clap back, to correct, to rise above by going louder. But that's ego's trick. Real elevation? It's quiet. It's humble. It's in letting the world see your grace when it least deserves it. You were never meant to fit at every table. You were born to build your own. Love you always, Pops. Shaq sat back, the letter trembling slightly in his hands. He read it again, slower. Not a single word was wasted. His stepfather had always been a man of few words, but when he spoke, every syllable landed. This letter felt like it had waited for the exact right moment to exist. He folded it again with care, slid it back into the envelope, and pressed it against his chest. That was the moment something inside him shifted, not out of rage but out of clarity. He didn't need to speak to the media. He didn't need to respond to Bellevue's apology or call for boycotts. The video had already moved hearts. The world had taken his silence and turned it into a chorus. Now it was time to move differently, not louder, but deeper. He walked outside to find Lucille trimming the rose bush along the fence. She looked up as he approached. "I'm not going to speak on it," he said. "I know," she replied. "But I'm going to do something." Lucille smiled softly. "I figured." Shaq nodded, the morning sun lighting his face. "Not for revenge, not for show, just so folks like me, kids like I was, don't have to ask for a seat ever again." Lucille leaned on the gardening spade. "Then do it right. Build something they can't ignore." And with that, he knew exactly what came next. Not a post. Not a protest. A plan. A table of his own. And this time, everyone would be welcome. The glass panels of Bellevue's restaurant had once been its pride, modern, pristine, designed to invite sunlight and reflect wealth. Now those same windows reflected signs, faces, and voices that had never been part of its target ambiance. For days, the sidewalk outside was lined with protesters. Some stood in quiet defiance, holding placards that read, "Excellence denied," and "Seats earned, still waiting." Others chanted peacefully, drawing in curious onlookers and media vans. What had begun as a quiet act of denial was now a public reckoning wrapped in politeness too sharp to ignore. Inside Bellevue's, the tables remained dressed, the service polite, the menus unchanged. Their core clientele affluent, largely white, continued to arrive, but they came with caution now. Eyes darting toward the protest lines, speaking more softly. Some canceled reservations quietly, citing unrelated conflicts. Others showed up out of curiosity or defiance, treating the controversy like a tourist attraction. The restaurant's management had adopted a strategy that felt deliberate, silence wrapped in subtle damage control. Staff were coached on how to respond. No public statements beyond the initial vague apology. No acknowledgement of the protesters outside. The hope was that it would pass, that the next viral moment would wipe theirs clean from memory. But it didn't pass, because Shaquille O'Neal still hadn't spoken. And that silence began to hum louder than any speech ever could. It wasn't just the absence of words. It was the space that absence created. It made people ask more questions, made journalists dig deeper, made social critics lean in closer. What did it mean when a man so public, so recognizable, refused to give the story the soundbite they craved? What was he building behind the silence? Bellevue's owner, Malcolm Raines, tried to wait it out from his office above the restaurant. He watched the footage play over and over again, online, unable to scrub the echo of Shaq's words from his mind. "I wonder how many seats I've earned, and still can't sit down." Malcolm had written a dozen drafts of a more personal apology, even considered reaching out directly to Shaq. But something always stopped him: ego, fear, the assumption that silence would eventually win. It didn't. While Bellevue's pressed pause, Lana West was being thrust into a storm of her own. Her phone buzzed constantly. News outlets wanted interviews. Influencers reposted her footage with captions like, "A new voice in truth-telling journalism." But Lana wasn't celebrating. She hadn't expected the scale, and more than once she wondered if she'd overstepped, if the moment she captured so instinctively had been hers to share at all. Her inbox was a war zone of praise, criticism, and emotional unloading. One message read, "That moment changed how I see my own silence." Another, "Your camera gave a voice to what I've felt for years." But those didn't always ease the gnawing inside her. She kept replaying the clip, not to watch Shaq but to read between the lines of his pause. She worried she'd captured something sacred, then handed it to a world that might only consume it. One night, unable to sleep, she walked past Bellevue's in silence. No protesters, just the empty glow of its interior after closing hours. She stood at the glass and looked in, at the empty chairs, the silverware still perfectly aligned. It struck her then. The silence wasn't just a tactic anymore. It was a truth. Bellevue's had built itself around a particular kind of quiet, a cultivated atmosphere, where discomfort was swept under minimalist decor, where presence was curated and managed. Shaq's rejection wasn't a glitch in their system, it was a function of it. Their silence now wasn't just avoidance, it was exposure. Meanwhile, Shaq remained out of sight. No press, no posts, but the world could feel something coming. Because sometimes, silence is the sound of something being built. The morning sun cast long shadows across the downtown streets as Shaquille O'Neal stepped out of his car. Today was different. The city buzzed with a new energy, charged with anticipation and unspoken promises. He adjusted the collar of his casual jacket, not the usual sportswear, but something understated, intentional. Behind him, discreet but steady, a few cameras trailed a small crew from a local documentary team. There not for spectacle, but to witness. But these weren't the flashing lenses of celebrity paparazzi. No frenzy, no intrusive questions. They were storytellers, invited to capture a moment of quiet power. Shaq's destination was just a block away from Bellevue's, a restaurant named The Hearth, owned and operated by a local black family. The Hearth was modest, warm, and unapologetically proud of its roots. It wasn't about fine dining or pretense. It was about community, heritage, and welcome. As Shaq approached Bellevue's, he didn't glance up at the gleaming windows. The empty chairs still set with crisp linens. He walked straight past without a flicker of acknowledgement. No anger, no bitterness. Just a man walking towards something that mattered more. The protesters had shifted their focus that morning. Some following Shaq's steps, others lingering outside Bellevue's, holding signs with messages like, "Building our own tables," and "Respect is earned, not given." Cameras from news outlets hovered, capturing the scene, but Shaq stayed focused ahead. At the entrance of The Hearth, the owner, Jeremiah Cole, stood waiting with a wide smile. Jeremiah was a man who carried the warmth of the South in his voice, and the quiet strength of generations in his stance. He greeted Shaq like an old friend, because in truth, they were connected by more than just a shared love of food and culture. "Big Shaq," Jeremiah said, clasping his hand firmly. "We're honored you're here." Shaq smiled, genuine and disarming. "Thank you, Jeremiah. This feels right." Inside, the atmosphere was intimate and alive. The walls were adorned with photographs of families, artists, and community events. The smell of collard greens, sweet potato pie, and freshly brewed coffee filled the air, comfort food for the body and soul. Shaq took his seat near the window, the camera crew settling quietly in the corner, capturing the easy exchange between him and the staff. Waiters approached with respectful warmth, not the cold calculation he'd experienced days before. Plates arrived laden with familiar Southern dishes, each bite a testament to care and pride. Throughout the meal, Shaq engaged with the staff and patrons, not as a celebrity but as a man who understood the power of belonging. He listened to stories from the kitchen, tales of how the restaurant had grown against odds, how it had become a refuge for many who'd felt invisible elsewhere. The footage the documentary crew captured wasn't sensational. It was human. It was real. It was the story of movement, not retaliation, of choosing to build instead of burn, of redefining power, not by confrontation, but by grace and action. Outside, the protesters cheered quietly as they watched from the sidewalk. Their signs lowered but their spirits lifted. The video of Shaq's entrance and warm reception at the Hearth quickly made its way online, adding a new chapter to the unfolding narrative. The contrast was striking. Bellevue's with its empty tables and forced apologies. The Hearth, alive with laughter, music, and open arms. Shaq's return was not about proving a point with force. It was about showing what true power looked like. Steady, patient, inclusive. Later that day, news outlets ran side-by-side images. Shaq being turned away at Bellevue's, and Shaq breaking bread at the Hearth. Commentators reflected on the symbolism. The movement was clear. Dignity could not be denied when it found a home, even if one had to build it from scratch. For Shaq, the day wasn't about victory. It was about legacy. He'd walked past exclusion, without a backward glance, and stepped into belonging with open arms. And in that choice, he changed the story. Quietly, boldly, forever. Weeks had passed since the brunch at the Hearth, but the ripple effect of Shaquille O'Neal's quiet protest was still swelling. Behind the scenes, away from cameras and headlines, Shaq had been working on something bigger. Something that would not just respond to one moment of exclusion, but challenge the very idea of who deserved a seat at the table. The result was the Real Table, a bold, mobile pop-up restaurant designed to travel across cities, towns, and rural communities all over America. It was a simple concept with profound intent: create a space where everyone, regardless of race, class, or background, could sit, share a meal, and be heard without judgment or reservation. The day the first pop-up launched in Atlanta was overcast, but alive. Shaq arrived early, not as a celebrity star but as a founder and participant. The massive truck that housed the kitchen and dining area had been custom-built, painted bright with the words, "The Real Table," emblazoned on its side. It was more than a restaurant on wheels. It was a symbol, a moving declaration that the old barriers could be dismantled and new spaces created. The setup was unlike any restaurant Shaq had ever been part of. Long communal tables stretched out under colorful tents, surrounded by banners quoting voices from history and present-day advocates for racial empathy and unity. There were no reservations, no exclusive wait lists. People arrived early, late, or whenever they could. Some came alone, others with families. All were greeted with the same warmth and openness. As the first diners settled in, Shaq took a moment before the crowd, microphone in hand. His voice, deep and steady, carried through the gathered crowd, not as a broadcast star, but as a man speaking from experience and conviction. "If the table ain't built for us," he said, "we build our own." The crowd erupted in cheers. It wasn't just the words but the promise behind them. That promise spread like wildfire on social media, the hashtag #NoRealTable climbing as people from across the country shared photos and videos of their own experiences visiting the pop-up. What set the Real Table apart wasn't just the food. Though the menu was thoughtfully curated, featuring dishes from a variety of cultures that celebrated diversity in flavor and history, it was the discussions that accompanied each meal. Trained facilitators led conversations about racial empathy, systemic barriers, and the ways communities could come together beyond social divides. Shaq moved through the crowd, sitting beside strangers, listening to their stories, and sharing his own. He heard tales of exclusion that echoed his own experiences, the quiet dismissals, the denied opportunities, the everyday battles fought without the world noticing. But he also heard stories of hope, resilience, and change. The initiative attracted attention from educators, activists, and politicians. Schools invited the Real Table to host sessions on inclusion and history. Nonprofits coordinated community outreach programs centered around its message. The project became a platform not just for food, but for healing, education, and transformation. Across the country, mobile kitchens inspired by Shaq's model popped up in other cities, adopting the same philosophy. The movement was no longer just about Shaq or Bellevue's. It was a national conversation about belonging, justice, and the power of intentional spaces. Shaq's public voice, until then, mostly silent after the brunch incident, now resonated through interviews and speeches, but always grounded in humility and purpose. He reminded audiences that change wasn't about tearing down alone, but building up together. In one widely viewed interview, Shaq said, "We're not asking for a handout, we're asking for a hand up. If the table ain't built for us, we build our own. And at that table, there's room for all of us." The viral moments returned, but this time the energy was different. There was no anger in the hashtags, no divisiveness in the comments. Instead, people shared stories of reconciliation, of meals that brought old enemies together, of neighborhoods united over shared food and open dialogue. The Real Table became a testament to the idea that dignity, respect, and empathy could be served alongside every dish. It was a movement rooted in the belief that belonging wasn't granted by those in power. It was created by those who refused to be sidelined. And for Shaq, the journey came full circle. From being denied a simple seat in a luxury restaurant to funding a project that put millions of seats out there for the taking. This was more than justice. It was legacy. A legacy not built on trophies or fame, but on the courage to rise quietly, to build boldly, and to invite everyone in. The table was open now, and everyone was welcome. The city was folding into dusk. The fading light wrapped Atlanta in a gentle hush, the kind that softens edges and pulls the day's noise into a quiet murmur. On a worn wooden bench beneath a street lamp, Shaquille O'Neal sat alone, his massive frame filling the space but somehow not overwhelming it. The bustle of downtown carried on around him, cars humming, distant laughter, the rhythm of life unspooling as night settled. Children ran past, their laughter ringing like bells, weaving between lampposts and darting around parked cars. One of the boys, A small kid with wide eyes pointed at Shaq and shouted, "Big Shaq!" The nickname, familiar and affectionate, drew a soft smile to Shaq's lips. He waved back, the warmth in his eyes unmistakable. To them, he was a hero, a gentle giant. But to Shaq, the moment was quiet, unmarked by grandeur or expectation. He watched the children disappear around the corner, their footsteps fading like a melody. Then his phone buzzed, a soft vibration on the bench beside him. He picked it up. A message from Lana West blinked on the screen. "Thank you for letting the world sit with you." Shaq's fingers hovered for a moment over the keyboard. Then he typed, simply, "We rising." He hit send and leaned back against the bench, eyes tracing the city skyline, now bathed in amber and violet. No spotlight, no applause, just the city he loved, the people he served, and the path ahead. Behind the screen, the camera lens slowly pulled back, revealing the vastness around him. No tables, no banners, no protests. Just a man who had been denied a seat, but refused to be denied dignity. A man immense not just in size but in heart, shaping a world that finally learned to see him, not for his fame, but for his unwavering grace. Shaq's story wasn't about noise or spectacle. It was about the power of quiet strength, the kind that doesn't demand attention but commands respect, the kind that builds rather than breaks. As the lights of the city flickered on one by one, the bench beneath him became more than just a place to sit. It was a symbol of patience, of persistence, of progress. And in that stillness, the world sat with him, together, rising. The end. This story is just the beginning. It's a challenge to look beyond the surface and question who's really invited to the table, and who's building new ones. Stand with the movement that refuses to be silent, that chooses action over anger. Keep watching, keep questioning, and remember, change happens when we rise together. The seat you want might not be waiting, but the table you build will be unstoppable.